You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC. I'm Razia Iqbal. Yemen now, and two humanitarian organisations have called on the United Nations to include the Saudi-led coalition fighting there on a list of violators of children's rights in conflict. A report by Save the Children and Watch List on Children and Armed Conflict has documented at least 160 attacks on hospitals and medical staff over the past 2 years. It says all warring parties in Yemen are implicated. Joining me now from the UN building in New York is Christine Monaghan, who is the research officer at Watch List on Children and Armed Conflict. It's a network of independent voices which advocate for children in war zones. Welcome to NewsHour. Let's start, if we may, just by getting you to give us some examples of how you are saying that children's rights have been violated in Yemen. Give us some concrete examples.
Absolutely. So we know that there has been a pattern of attacks on hospitals. As you mentioned, 160 have been perpetrated by the Saudi Arabia-led coalition, as well as the Houthis and their allies in the past 2 years of the conflict, which means that children can't access the medical care that they need, either when they're injured due to the conflict or even for basic and routine care, such as cancer treatment or dialysis. The UN has reported that every 10 minutes a child in Yemen dies of a preventable cause, which we can trace in correlation to attacks on hospitals as well as denial of access to humanitarian aid.
Okay, so you've mentioned both the Saudi-led coalition and also the people that they're fighting, the Houthi rebels. Is there evidence that it's the Saudis who are being particularly cavalier in the way in which they use force?
I think both parties to the conflict are committing violations that are in defiance of international norms, particularly relating to the access and availability of humanitarian aid and the protection of medical facilities and personnel.
So why then are you singling out Saudi Arabia then when you yourself are acknowledging that all sides are implicated?
Absolutely. So I will, give you a couple incidents. There have been repeated attacks specifically on hospitals and clinics that are carried out through airstrikes. In one incident, there was a tent hospital that was hit by an airstrike. There was nothing else around it for miles. In other incidents, medical facilities, particularly MSF facilities, have been hit by Saudi Arabia-led coalition airstrikes after the coordinates were given to Saudi Arabia as well as the Houthis and parties to the conflict. So what this indicates is that this is a pattern of attacks and that it's a tactic of war that's being used by the coalition. The Houthis have already been placed on the Secretary General's list of perpetrators of violations against children's rights in armed conflict for attacks on hospitals in Yemen, and we are calling for Saudi Arabia-led coalition to be listed as well.
To what extent do you hold Western governments such as Britain and the United States as being complicit in this, given that they are close allies to Saudi Arabia, they share intelligence and they supply armaments?
They certainly have a role to play, both in the ways that impunity has been enabled through first the Saudi Arabia-led coalition being removed from the Secretary General's list last year, and then, as you mentioned, the sale of arms to the Saudi Arabia-led coalition and other forms of support. So by acts of omission and commission, certainly the United States and the UK have played a role, but also could play a role in preventing this.
Christine Monaghan, a research officer at Watch List on Children and Armed Conflict, joining us live from New York. Thanks. Let's speak now to Ali Shihabi, who is the executive director of the Arabia Foundation, a new Washington, D.C.-based group which describes its mission to provide insight into and analysis of the geopolitics of the Arabian Peninsula. What's your response to this report?
Look, the issue of children is one that is painful for everybody. Children always suffer in war, and human tragedy always accompanies war. I think the question that people have to ask themselves, is there an intent on behalf of the Saudi-led coalition to cause human suffering? Is that a strategy of war? And I think there has been no evidence supplied by anybody really to document that. What has happened is that when you are fighting a non-conventional guerrilla force, that non-conventional guerrilla force the only real weapon it has to fight against the modern army, which has, planes and helicopters and all the accoutrements of modern warfare, is the public relations war.
Sure,
so
but okay, so Ed, there are always casualties. We're very short of time. There are always casualties in a conflict, of course, but has there ever been anyone who's been held responsible for those who've dropped bombs on hospitals, for instance?
Well, we haven't had any independent investigations. What has happened is that the site of warfare or where the incidents happen are controlled by the Houthis. Independent observers don't have instant access to them. When they come to them under the accompaniment of the Houthis, those sites have already been corrupted. So we have not had really an independent verification that hospitals and children's facilities have been intentionally hit. So the fundamental point is this collateral damage in warfare? And there are mistakes that also happen in warfare. Let me just remind you, America hit a hospital in Syria just a month ago and killed over 100 people. When we talk about Médecins Sans Frontières, we remember the incident where American helicopters repeatedly attacked the hospital in Afghanistan. So okay. The world's best militaries make these sort of mistakes. Yet if the Saudi military makes them, it becomes a strategic act of war. This is where I think people are not being fair, really. Now, I'll give you another statistic.
We have about 20 seconds, sir.
Well, let me give you that in the 20 seconds. Saudi Arabia is providing nearly 300,000 scholarships for Yemeni children in Saudi Arabia to go to school at government expense.
Okay.
Give me one government in the world that is providing 300,000 scholarships for refugees in their country.
Okay, we will leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Ali Shihabi, Executive Director of the Arabia Foundation, joining us from Washington, D.C.